By the time Mira Vale realized she had consumed far too much wine, the Moon Festival banquet had already become pleasantly blurry around the edges. Music drifted through the palace ballroom bright and elegant, while nobles laughed beneath silver lanterns and servants moved between them with trays of crystal cups. Mira should have been cataloging diplomatic correspondence in the archives tomorrow morning. Instead, she was leaning against a marble pillar, staring into the bottom of her fourth, or possibly fifth glass. Her aunt's words kept repeating in her head. A respectable merchant. A practical marriage. The family debt would finally disappear. Practical. Mira hated that word. She escaped the ballroom before anyone could notice her expression, and pushed through an open door onto a moonlit balcony. Someone was already there. Alpha King Kale Arden stood alone near the stone railing, broad shoulders turned toward the gardens below. Even half-drunk, Mira recognized him instantly. Everyone did. She should have bowed. Instead she sighed. Kale looked over. "Your Majesty," she said after a moment, remembering herself far too late. His mouth shifted slightly. "Archivist Vale." Mira blinked. "You know who I am?" "I know who works in my palace." That seemed suspiciously reasonable. She lifted her glass toward him. "Do kings ever get tired of everyone trying to marry them?" One of his eyebrows rose. Mira gestured vaguely toward the ballroom. "Half those women have been paraded past you like decorated horses." A dangerous silence followed. Then Kale laughed once quietly. Encouraged, Mira stepped closer. "It must be easy though. Being king. You can marry whoever you want." "Can I?" "Obviously." Behind them, the balcony doors remained open. Mira barely noticed the courtiers standing just inside. She looked Kale over with exaggerated seriousness. "You know what? If everyone is so desperate for you to choose someone, you should marry me." Kale went completely still. Mira grinned and raised her cup. "There. Problem solved." She expected him to laugh. Instead, his gaze settled on her with unsettling intensity. "Done." Mira stared at him. Then she burst into laughter. "You're terrible." Kale held out his hand. Still believing he was continuing the joke, Mira placed hers in it. His fingers closed around hers. Behind them someone gasped. Mira turned toward the sound, but Kale gently drew her attention back. His expression was calm. Far too calm. No take-backs. The next morning, Mira woke with a pounding headache, 3 broken fragments of memory, and the absolute certainty that she had humiliated herself in front of the Alpha King. Then someone knocked. Her aunt rushed inside, pale with shock. "Mira," she whispered. "The palace is announcing your engagement." Mira stopped breathing. "To whom?" Her aunt stared at her. 5 minutes later, a royal messenger arrived. His Majesty requested her presence immediately. Not to discuss whether the engagement would be cancelled. To discuss the wedding. Mira spent the entire walk to the king's private study trying to invent an explanation that did not begin with "I was drunk" and end with "please forget everything I said." She failed. When the guards opened the doors, Kale was standing behind a broad wooden desk, already dressed for the day. There was no sign that he had spent the previous evening drinking, much less accepting marriage proposals from intoxicated archivists. Mira stopped several steps inside. "Your Majesty." "Archivist Vale." The calmness of his voice irritated her immediately. "You remember last night?" "Very clearly." Of course he did. Mira clasped her hands to keep from covering her face. "Then you also remember that I was drunk." "I noticed." "And joking." Kale regarded her for a moment. "That part was less obvious. I asked you to marry me while holding a cup I could barely keep upright. You held it remarkably well. This is not funny." "No," he said. "It has become unexpectedly political." That silenced her. Kale gestured toward a chair, but Mira remained standing. "Several representatives from the northern packs witnessed my acceptance," he explained. "For months, their leaders have expected me to secure an alliance through marriage. By accepting another proposal publicly, I effectively rejected those negotiations." Mira felt the blood drain from her face. "So cancel it." "If I announce this morning that my word as king becomes meaningless when inconvenient, every agreement at the conclave becomes harder to negotiate." Her stomach tightened. "Then I'm trapped." No, the answer came immediately. Cale stepped away from the desk, stopping well short of her. I will not marry you against your will. Mira searched his face for the catch. There is a conclave of Pax approaching, he continued. Until it concludes, we maintain the engagement publicly. Afterward, we can dissolve it under circumstances that do not damage either of us. And until then, you remain yourself. That sounds suspiciously simple. You will attend the appearances required of my future wife. You will have separate rooms. Public engagement grants me no private rights over you. The directness of it loosened something in her chest. Then another problem returned. My family. Cale's expression sharpened slightly. Mira hated admitting it. They arranged another marriage. A merchant agreed to settle our debt in exchange for it. If I publicly embarrass the crown and that arrangement disappears too. She left the rest unfinished. Cale understood. Then the engagement protects you from that arrangement until we find a lawful solution. Mira stared at him. He said it as though helping her escape one unwanted marriage while pretending to prepare for another was perfectly ordinary. She finally Saturday. There is something I still don't understand. I suspect there are several things. Why did you say yes? For the first time, Cale did not answer immediately. Mira leaned forward. You could have laughed. You could have ignored me. You could have told the drunken archivist to go back inside before she destroyed her career. But I said yes. Exactly. His gaze held hers. Drunk people sometimes say things sober people are afraid to say. Heat rushed into Mira's face. I am not secretly desperate to marry you. The corner of his mouth moved. Stop doing that. Doing what? Looking like you know something I don't. I know that you proposed. As a joke. So you keep insisting. Mira stood abruptly. Fine. If logic would not persuade him, she needed another approach. The arrangement only had to survive until the conclave. Cale believed he could tolerate her that long because he had seen nothing except an amusing drunken stranger and a frightened palace archivist. That could be corrected. She knew almost nothing about being a future Luna, but she knew enough about court expectations to understand what a king's bride was supposed to look like. Elegant, diplomatic, polished, obedient to ceremony. Mira could be none of those things with astonishing efficiency. If Cale refused to cancel because of politics, she would make him discover for himself that marrying her would be far worse. She reached the door. Mira. She stopped at hearing her given name for the first time. When she looked back, Cale's expression had become unreadable again. You are free to dislike this arrangement, he said. You are free to dislike me. But you do not need to be afraid of either. For one uncomfortable second, her planned rebellion felt embarrassingly childish. Then Mira remembered his infuriating almost smile. She lifted her chin. We'll see. She walked out with a new objective. If she could not take back her ridiculous proposal, she would make the Alpha King take back his answer. Mira discovered the first opportunity to make herself unsuitable 3 days later. The Royal Council reception was exactly the sort of event she had always avoided. Polished floors, polished smiles, and polished people discussing matters that would affect thousands of lives as though they were arranging flowers. Tonight, however, Mira was expected to stand beside Cale. A court attendant had spent an hour explaining how a future Luna should behave. Speak only when invited. Avoid controversial subjects. Smile when introduced. Never contradict senior counselors publicly. Mira had listened carefully. Then she decided to do almost the opposite. If Cale wanted an elegant political bride, she would show him what an appalling mistake he had made. The opportunity arrived when an elderly counselor began explaining a proposed winter levy on several remote packs. The additional contribution is necessary to strengthen the northern reserves before winter, he said. Around the chamber, heads nodded. Mira glanced at Cale. He was listening without expression. Perfect. She cleared her throat. The western settlements can't afford it. Silence fell. The counselor slowly turned toward her. Mira smiled pleasantly. He did not. My lady, he said. The matter has been reviewed. Then someone reviewed the wrong records. A few nobles exchanged startled looks. This was going beautifully. Cale looked at her. Mira waited for irritation. Instead he said, Explain. That was not part of the plan. She hesitated. The grain reports from Red Hollow and the surrounding settlements show 2 failed harvests in 3 years. Their tax recovery only looks stable because last year's figures include emergency timber sales. The counselor frowned. Those reports were accounted for. No, the totals were accounted for. The source was not. Mira had catalogued those records herself. She crossed to the table before remembering that future queens probably did not seize financial documents from senior officials. Too late now. She found the relevant page. Here. If you impose another levy before winter, they will either sell breeding stock or reduce food stores. Either choice weakens them next year. The room had become painfully quiet. Mira looked toward Cale again. Surely this was enough. She had interrupted his counsel, contradicted an experienced official, and handled royal documents like an archivist instead of standing decoratively beside the throne. Cale leaned over the figures. How many settlements? 7 directly. Possibly 9 if the eastern routes freeze early. The counselor opened his mouth. Cale raised one hand. Have the levy proposal recalculated, using the original regional reports. Mira blinked. The counselor bowed stiffly. Yes, Your Majesty. That was it. No humiliation. No reprimand. Worse, several advisors were now studying her with reluctant interest. Mira spent the rest of the reception behaving impeccably out of sheer annoyance. When the chamber finally emptied, she tried to escape with the departing officials. Archivist Vale. She stopped. Cale was still beside the council table. Mira turned slowly. Your Majesty. You deliberately contradicted my counsel. I did. Were you trying to embarrass me? There seemed little point lying. Yes. Cale considered that. And instead you prevented me from approving a potentially damaging levy. Mira folded her arms. I can make mistakes too if that would help. That almost smile appeared again. Infuriating man. He gathered the reports but did not dismiss her. Why are you in the archives? Mira frowned. Because that is my employment. That wasn't my question. He tapped the corrected figures. You noticed something my advisors missed because you understood where the numbers came from. Why does someone capable of that spend her days trying so hard not to be noticed? The question landed harder than it should have. Mira's instinctive answer rose immediately. Because being useful quietly was safe. Because her family praised her when she solved problems and reminded her of her place whenever she wanted anything for herself. Because invisible girls were rarely rejected in public. She smiled instead. I enjoy dust. Cale watched her long enough that she knew the joke had failed. But he did not press. He simply handed the reports to an attendant waiting near the door. Mira turned to leave. Then something bothered her. She looked back. How did you know I worked in the archives before the engagement? Cale's gaze met hers. You told me your name. Not my occupation. A beat passed. Then Cale said calmly, You work in my palace. The same answer he had given on the balcony. Except now it no longer sounded sufficient. Mira walked away with an unpleasant realization. Her first attempt to make Cale regret choosing her had somehow made him more interested. Embarrassing him clearly wasn't going to work. She would need a much worse plan. Mira's worst plan began with a simple conclusion. Competence had failed spectacularly. If behaving like an incompetent future Luna would only give Cale opportunities to discover that she was useful, then she would stop trying to be incompetent. She would simply be incompatible. Her next required appearance was a ceremonial visit through the capital market, where royal merchants had prepared displays of jewelry, imported fabrics, carved silver, and other expensive things Mira had spent most of her life learning not to want. A court attendant quietly reminded her that the future Luna was expected to show interest in the prestigious vendors. Mira thanked him. Then she walked directly past them. She stopped at a modest stall selling hand-woven winter blankets. The merchant froze when he recognized Cale behind her. Mira picked up one of the blankets. How long does this take to make? The terrified man swallowed. Nearly 6 days, my lady. And how much? He named a price. Mira frowned. That's too little. The merchant looked horrified, as though he had somehow answered incorrectly. Mira turned the blanket over, examining the stitching. You're paying for wool dye and 6 days of labor. Either you're terrible at arithmetic or someone is forcing your prices down. Behind her, Cale made a suspicious sound that might have been suppressed laughter. Mira ignored him. She continued through the market exactly as she pleased, speaking to ordinary craftsmen instead of the prestigious merchants prepared for her visit. When a jeweler presented an elaborate ceremonial necklace, she stared at its mountain of gemstones and asked how many winter storehouses the same amount of silver could repair. The jeweler nearly choked. Cale merely asked for the answer. By midday, Mira was exhausted from trying to offend royal expectations and increasingly irritated that Cale seemed to be enjoying himself. Then one of the palace attendants stepped backward into a small pottery display. 3 bowls crashed onto the stones. The young vendor went pale. The attendant immediately apologized, but Mira saw the man's expression as he stared at the broken pieces. 3 bowls meant very little to a palace. They might mean considerably more to him. While Cale was speaking with a trade representative, Mira slipped several coins from her personal allowance onto the vendor's table. For the damage. My lady, I can't. Yes, you can. The palace will compensate me. Eventually. She pushed the coins toward him. Buy your materials today. Mira walked away before anyone could make a ceremony of it. She had almost reached the next stall when Cale fell into step beside her. You know the palace would have paid him. Eventually. That sounds familiar. Mira glanced sideways. He had seen. Of course he had. You are remarkably difficult to embarrass. So I am beginning to understand. This entire morning was supposed to demonstrate that I am completely unsuitable for court life. You questioned inflated prices, ignored people who expected special treatment, and compensated a man for damage caused by my household. When you describe it that way, you ruin everything. I suspected that was your intention. Mira stopped walking. You knew. I suspected. And you let me continue? Cale's expression remained maddeningly composed. I wanted to see what you would do. Before Mira could answer, an advisor approached Cale and murmured something too quietly for her to hear. His amusement disappeared. The rest of the visit ended early. That evening, Cale came to the sitting room adjoining Mira's chambers. He remained near the doorway rather than entering fully. Someone has begun investigating your family. Mira's stomach tightened. Who? Lord Varric's people. She knew the name. Varric led the Northern Alliance whose expected marriage arrangement Cale had disrupted by accepting hers. What are they looking for? Anything that makes this engagement vulnerable. Mira immediately thought of the debt. Cale apparently read the answer in her face. They found it. She looked away. So this is where you solve everything with royal money? No, that made her look back. I can have my officials examine the debt and determine what lawful options exist, Cale said. But I will not interfere unless you want me to. You're asking permission? It is your family. Mira had expected command, perhaps even rescue. Instead he simply waited. That somehow made accepting harder. Finally she nodded. Look into it. I will. He turned to leave. Cale. He stopped. It was the first time she had deliberately used his name. Thank you. Something softened in his expression before he walked away. Mira remained alone, disturbed by how safe the room suddenly felt. Her plan had failed again. Worse, she was beginning to understand why. She had spent days trying to show Cale everything a future Luna should never be. Yet every attempt had revealed something real instead. And somewhere between the council chamber and the market, the question had changed. She was no longer wondering how to make the Alpha King stop wanting this engagement. She was beginning to wonder whether she still wanted him to. The question became considerably harder to ignore over the next several days. The conclave was approaching, and Cale seemed determined to personally review every dispute, supply report, border petition, and alliance proposal that crossed his desk. Mira knew because the archives supplied half of them. She also knew he had slept very little. Late one evening, after delivering a bundle of corrected records to the council chamber, she found him alone at the long table. The lamps had burned low. Cale sat with one hand pressed against his forehead, surrounded by documents that looked capable of defeating an army through sheer quantity. You look terrible, Mira said. His eyes opened. That is an unusual greeting for your king. I considered your majesty, you look terrible. but it seemed unnecessarily formal. He almost smiled, but even that looked tired. Mira placed the records down. You should eat. I have eaten. When? Cale looked toward the papers as though one of them might contain the answer. Mira sighed. She left before he could object and returned with bread, cold meat, fruit, and tea from the kitchens. Cale stared at the tray. I didn't ask for this. That is why it contains food instead of another border report. She expected him to dismiss her after eating. He didn't. So Mira stayed. For a while neither spoke. Cale worked through the documents while she reorganized several reports into an order that made considerably more sense than whatever system his advisors had used. Eventually he leaned back. Do you know what every proposed marriage presented to me has included? Mira glanced up. A beautiful woman? Land. She paused. Armies. Trade routes. Bloodlines. Access to ports. Grain contracts. Political obligations. His voice contained no bitterness, only exhaustion. People discuss whom I should marry as though they are deciding where to build a fortress. Mira looked at him differently then. She had spent weeks thinking of Cale as the person with all the choices. Perhaps being wanted for a crown was simply another way of not being seen. At least my proposal came with nothing, she said lightly. Cale looked at her. That was precisely what made it unusual. Mira's smile faded. You were the first woman who ever asked me to marry her without first explaining what the marriage would provide. Guilt tightened beneath her ribs. He believed there had been something honest inside that ridiculous moment. She remembered moonlight, wine, her own laughter. Not courage, not intention, a joke. Cale's gaze remained on her. You've become very quiet. I'm deciding whether that was romantic or insulting. Have you decided? Ask me after another drink. Something changed in his face. The joke suddenly felt dangerous. Mira looked down. Do you regret saying yes? No, the answer came without hesitation. She lifted her eyes again. The room seemed smaller. Cale stood, slowly enough that she could have moved away. She didn't. He came close, stopping just before touching her. Mira could hear his breathing. Her heart was behaving absurdly. For one suspended moment she thought he would kiss her. Worse, she wanted him to. Cale's gaze dropped briefly to her mouth. Then he stepped back. Mira stared at him, confused and unexpectedly disappointed. You stopped? Yes. Why? Because this engagement began with a choice you don't fully remember making. The word struck deeper than any kiss could have. If something happens between us, Cale continued quietly, I want to know you chose that too. Mira could think of nothing clever enough to hide behind. That frightened her more than his power ever had. 3 days ago she had been trying to make him reject her. Now the thought of leaving after the conclave hurt. She swallowed. So none of this is only politics. Cale's expression changed almost imperceptibly. No, her pulse jumped. Then why did you accept? For a moment she thought he might finally answer. Instead he said, that is a conversation we should have when you are certain what you want from me. Mira should have been frustrated. Instead she understood. He was giving the question back to her. And she was terrified of answering it. The next morning, while Mira was still trying to convince herself that the previous night had changed nothing, Lord Varick received the testimony he had been seeking. There were witnesses who remembered exactly how much Mira had drunk at the Moon Festival. Enough to prove that when she had laughingly asked the Alpha King to marry her, she had never understood that he might actually say yes. By afternoon, Lord Varick no longer needed to investigate quietly. He sent a private request for Mira to meet him in one of the palace receiving rooms. She nearly refused, but refusing would not make whatever he had discovered disappear. Varick was waiting beside the window when she entered. He wasted no time. I have statements from 6 people who witnessed your proposal. Mira kept her expression still. There were considerably more than 6. 6 who are willing to describe your condition. Her stomach tightened. Varick placed several pages on the table between them. You were intoxicated enough to stumble. You repeatedly treated the exchange as a joke. At least 2 witnesses heard you laughing after His Majesty accepted. Mira looked at the papers but did not touch them. What do you want? A correction. To what? to the fiction that this engagement represents a deliberate choice. His tone remained perfectly controlled. If the conclave believes the Alpha King knowingly turned an intoxicated woman's joke into a binding royal engagement, his judgment will be questioned. Some may call it exploitation. Anger flashed through her. He has never forced me to do anything. That distinction may matter privately. Politically, appearances are often more useful than truth. Mira hated that he was right about the danger. Varric moved another document toward her. Publicly acknowledged that the proposal meant nothing. Withdraw before the conclave considers the matter. And in exchange, your family's debt disappears. Mira stared at him. He had found everything. The merchant arrangement as well? Resolved. It was exactly what she had wanted days ago. Freedom. No engagement. No unwanted marriage. No debt hanging over her family. Yet the offer now felt like a knife. And if I refuse? Then the witnesses speak at the conclave. Mira left without accepting. She went directly to Cale. He was in his study when she entered, and one look at her face made him dismiss the advisor standing beside his desk. When they were alone, Mira closed the door. Varric knows. Cale's expression hardened. How much? Enough. She told him about the witnesses, the threatened challenge, and the offer concerning her family's debt. Cale listened without interrupting. When she finished, silence filled the study. There was only one truth left to tell. Mira forced herself to face him. He isn't lying about that night. Cale said nothing. I was joking. The words hurt more than she expected. I remember enough now to know that. I wasn't secretly gathering courage to propose. I was drunk and angry about my family arranging my life, and you were standing there and I thought it was funny. Cale's face became unreadable. Mira continued before fear could stop her. And when I realized you weren't going to cancel the engagement, I tried to make you regret it. The council reception. Yes. The market. Yes. A faint, humorless breath escaped him. At least that explains several things. I thought if I embarrassed you enough, you would send me back to the archives and pretend none of it happened. You could have told me. I didn't trust that telling you would be enough. That was the sentence that changed him. Not anger. Something quieter. You believed manipulating me was safer than trusting me with the truth. Mira looked down. Yes. Cale walked toward the window. For several moments he said nothing. Then he asked, do you want to leave? The answer should have been easy. Once it had been all she wanted. Now she could barely breathe around it. I don't know. Cale turned. When the conclave ends, the engagement ends if you want it to. Your family's debt will be addressed lawfully. There will be no punishment, no retaliation, and no obligation to me. Mira stared at him. He was giving her everything she had spent weeks trying to obtain. Freedom. And it felt unbearable. You don't have to do that. Yes, I do. Because Varric threatened you? No. Because you should never have to wonder whether staying beside me is the price of being safe. Mira's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him that things had changed. That somewhere between failed sabotage, market stalls, cold dinners, and one almost kiss, pretending had become more frightening than the engagement itself. But if she said it now, would he believe her? After admitting that the proposal had been meaningless? After admitting that she had manipulated him? She could not find the courage. Cale returned to his desk. The distance between them felt larger than the room. Mira understood then what she had done. She had finally told the truth, but too late to prevent it from hurting him. And Varric still possessed the witnesses. If the challenge reached the conclave, Cale's restraint would not matter. His enemies could turn her drunken mistake into evidence against his judgment. There was only one way Mira could prevent that. She would make the truth public herself. She would end the engagement before Varric could use it against him. It was exactly the escape she had wanted from the beginning. Only now, for the first time, Mira desperately wished she did not have to take it. The conclave opened beneath banners representing every major pack in the kingdom. Mira stood beside Cale at the front of the chamber, and tried not to think about how many times she had imagined escaping this exact position. Now she wanted nothing more than to remain there. Lord Varric sat among the northern delegation, composed and patient. Waiting. Mira knew what would happen if she allowed him to speak first. The witnesses would become weapons. Cale's acceptance would be described without his restraint afterward. Every choice he had given her would disappear beneath the easier story of a king taking advantage of a drunken woman. She could not let that become his burden. Before the formal negotiations began, Mira stepped forward. Cale looked at her. She had not told him she intended to do this. "My lords, there is something concerning my engagement that should be settled before this conclave proceeds." Whispers spread across the chamber. Varric's expression sharpened. Mira kept going. "The night I asked Alpha King Cale to marry me, I was intoxicated." The room fell silent. "I treated the proposal as a joke. I did not expect him to accept, and when I understood what had happened the next morning, I wanted the engagement cancelled." Cale did not interrupt her. That somehow made continuing harder. Mira reached for the engagement token she carried and removed it. "His Majesty owes me nothing for words I did not intend as a serious promise." She turned toward him. For one terrible moment, the chamber disappeared. There was only Cale. Mira placed the token in his hand. "I release you from mine." Something moved behind his eyes, but his fingers closed around the token. He did not stop her. That was what she had asked of him from the beginning. Freedom. Mira stepped away from his side. The political response came immediately. Varric rose. With the misunderstanding resolved, perhaps the crown can now return to the alliance discussions interrupted by this unfortunate episode. Everyone understood what he meant. His daughter. The northern marriage. Military support. A politically useful queen instead of an archivist who had accidentally become one for a few weeks. Mira did not stay to hear the negotiations. She returned to her rooms and began packing. There was surprisingly little to take. Most of what surrounded her belonged to the palace. Her own life could still fit into the same modest cases she had brought when the engagement began. By evening, she had almost finished when someone from the archives arrived with documents she had requested days earlier. The papers included preliminary notes from the conclave. Mira should not have read them. She did. The Northern Alliance had renewed its marriage proposal. Cale had refused. Mira read the line twice. Then a third time. Without the engagement, there was no longer any political reason to reject it. Varric's alliance offered troops, trade access, and stability along the northern border. Cale had released Mira exactly as promised. And still he had refused the easier choice. Her hands began to shake. Suddenly she saw the pattern she had spent weeks refusing to see. Cale had never prevented her from leaving. She had been the one constantly hiding. First behind drunken laughter. Then sabotage. Then jokes whenever his questions came too close. Even her public withdrawal had allowed her to decide what was best for him without ever saying the one thing that mattered. She wanted him. The realization was terrifying precisely because it was simple. All her life, wanting something openly had felt dangerous. If she never admitted what mattered, no one could truly reject her. She could always claim she had been joking, that she did not care, that she had never wanted it anyway. Her first proposal had been safe because it meant nothing. A second would mean everything. Mira looked at her packed case. She could leave. Cale had guaranteed her safety. Her debt would not become a chain around her neck. She could return to the archives and rebuild the quiet life she understood. No humiliation. No risk. No rejection. And perhaps spend years wondering what would have happened if just once she had stopped pretending not to want something. Mira dropped the papers onto the bed. She was halfway to the door before fear caught up with her. What if Cale refused? This time there would be no wine to blame. No joke to retreat behind. No misunderstanding. He would hear exactly what she wanted and he would be completely free to say no. Mira's hand tightened around the door handle. Then she remembered his words. You should never have to wonder whether staying beside me is the price of being safe. He had given her freedom even when it hurt him. The least she could do was use it honestly. Mira opened the door. For the first time since the Moon Festival, she was not trying to escape an accidental engagement. She was going back to the conclave to make a choice. Mira reached the conclave chamber before she could lose her nerve. The guards recognized her and opened the doors. Conversation stopped almost immediately. Cale stood at the central table, surrounded by maps, agreements, and representatives from the assembled packs. Lord Varric was across from him, one hand resting on a document Mira suspected contained yet another version of the Northern Alliance proposal. Every face turned toward her. For one instinctive second, Mira wanted to smile and make some ridiculous remark about forgetting something. The old defense rose easily. She let it die. I need to say something. Varric frowned. Lady Mira, this council is conducting. Let her speak. Cale's voice silenced the room. Mira walked forward until she stood several steps from him. Her heart was pounding harder than it had the first time she proposed. I told everyone this morning that my proposal was a joke, she said. That was true. A murmur moved through the chamber. I was drunk. I was angry. I never imagined you would actually accept. And afterward, I tried to make you regret it because I was too afraid to simply tell you I wanted out. Cale watched her without moving. The council reception was deliberate. So was the market. I thought if I behaved badly enough, you would decide I wasn't worth the trouble. A few people exchanged glances. Mira ignored them. But somewhere along the way, I stopped wanting you to send me away. The room became very still. I should have told you that too. Instead, I made another decision for both of us. I ended the engagement because I thought protecting you was easier than admitting what I wanted. Cale's expression softened, but he did not approach her. You came back to tell me? I came back because I'm tired of using jokes whenever something matters. For several breaths neither moved. Then Cale looked toward the gathered leaders. There is something you should know as well. Mira's stomach tightened. Cale's gaze returned to her. I knew who you were before the Moon Festival. She stared at him. How? The archives. Her mind immediately returned to every moment when his knowledge of her had seemed slightly impossible. Cale continued. For months, reports reached my council with errors corrected in the margins. Supply calculations. Regional records. Tax summaries. The corrections were unsigned. Mira's breath caught. She knew. Those notes. I traced them. To me. Yes. The answer was simple. The implications were not. Cale stepped around the table, though he maintained the distance between them. Later, I saw you defend a servant who had been blamed for an error she didn't make. You had nothing to gain from it. You could have remained invisible. Mira barely remembered the incident. Apparently Cale did. You noticed me. Long before you noticed me. A nervous laugh almost escaped her, but she swallowed it. Then why didn't you say anything? For the first time, something vulnerable entered Cale's expression. Because I am your king. Mira frowned. If I approached a woman employed in my palace and told her I wanted her, how could I know whether her yes meant yes? The answer struck her silent. How could you know, Cale continued, that refusing me was safe? Everything rearranged itself. The balcony. His immediate recognition. The way he knew where she worked. His patience with every attempt to sabotage the engagement. His refusal to kiss her when she had not yet understood what she wanted. Mira whispered. So when I proposed, you approached me. His eyes held hers. For once, there was no council presenting a bride. No family negotiating terms. No alliance attached to the question. You walked onto that balcony, insulted half the court, complained about marriage politics and asked me yourself. I was drunk. I was aware. And you said yes. I had wanted the opportunity to speak to you for months. The truth landed with almost painful clarity. Her proposal had never created his interest. It had merely opened a door he had refused to force open himself. Varric broke the silence. Touching as this explanation may be, Your Majesty, personal affection does not resolve the Northern question. Cale turned toward him. No. It does not. He picked up the document on the table. The alliance you offer would strengthen the border. Varric inclined his head. But its price is a marriage I do not choose. Cale set the document down. I refuse. The chamber erupted in whispers. Mira stared at him. He was giving up something real. Not because an accidental engagement required it. That engagement no longer existed. Cale reached into his coat and removed the token Mira had returned that morning. He held it out to her. This does not bind you. Mira looked at the token but did not take it. You owe me no proposal because I wanted you first. You owe me nothing because I accepted once before. His voice lowered. You are free, Mira. There it was. No arrangement. No drunken promise. No political excuse. Nothing left between them except choice. Cale closed his fingers around the token. Now tell me what you want. Fear rose through her. Mira could still leave. She could return to the archives, where records were predictable and mistakes could be corrected in margins. Or she could finally say something she could never pretend was a joke. She stepped closer. I want you. Cale went utterly still. Mira's voice trembled, but she did not look away. I want the impossible man who keeps ruining all my excellent plans. I want the king who asks permission when he could command. And I want the exhausted idiot who forgets to eat when there are too many reports on his desk. Someone in the chamber coughed. Mira ignored them. And this time, she said, I know exactly what I'm asking. She offered Cale her hand, completely sober, completely terrified. Alpha King Cale Arden, will you marry me? He looked at her hand, then at her. Unlike the first time, he did not answer immediately. Are you certain? Mira understood what the pause meant. He was still giving her room to withdraw. Yes. Cale took her hand. But before he could speak, Mira tightened her fingers around his. Yes, she said again. Before you ask me back. Yes. The smile that finally broke across his face was nothing like the restrained almost smile she had spent weeks trying to interpret. This one belonged entirely to the man. And Mira realized that the first proposal had trapped neither of them. It had only begun the long, ridiculous journey toward the first choice they were finally making together. The northern question did not disappear simply because Cale had chosen Mira. Over the following weeks, negotiations continued without a marriage agreement to simplify them. Trade routes had to be reconsidered, border responsibilities redistributed, and military commitments negotiated on their own merits. Cale complained that diplomacy would be easier if everyone stopped attempting to exchange daughters for soldiers. Mira reminded him that insulting half the nobility was supposed to be her specialty. He told her she was becoming territorial. She told him there were no take-backs. The phrase had somehow become considerably less threatening. Mira did not abandon the archives when preparations for the wedding began. Instead, the work that had once kept her safely invisible became impossible to ignore. The same regional knowledge that had exposed the flawed winter levy proved useful during negotiations over supplies and local administration. At Cale's recommendation, and after review by the council rather than royal decree alone, Mira received an official advisory position concerning regional records and administration. For once, recognition did not frighten her. She had earned the work before anyone knew she might become Luna. Marriage merely made it harder for everyone to overlook. Her family's debt required a less romantic solution. Cale did not erase it with royal money. Palace officials reviewed the agreements, separated legitimate obligations from the marriage arrangement attached to them, and established terms her family could actually repay. Mira was relieved. She did not want freedom purchased by exchanging one powerful man's protection for another man's claim. She wanted a life she had chosen. On the evening of the wedding celebration, silver lanterns once again illuminated the palace. Music filled the ballroom. Nobles danced beneath the same high ceilings where Mira had once consumed enough wine to reorganize her entire future. She accepted exactly one cup that evening. Then she carried it through the familiar doors onto the moonlit balcony. Cale found her there a few minutes later. You disappeared from your own celebration. I learned from a king. He came to stand beside her at the railing. For a moment neither spoke. The gardens below looked almost exactly as they had on the moon festival night. Mira remembered leaning against the stone, complaining about practical marriages and powerful men. She remembered believing that nothing she said mattered because she could always laugh afterward. She looked down at the cup in her hand. One, she said. Cale glanced at it. I wasn't going to ask. You were thinking it. I was wondering whether I should summon witnesses. Mira laughed. This time the laughter hid nothing. She set the cup aside. Then she turned toward him. There was no council here. No family bargain. No northern alliance. No temporary arrangement protecting either of them from consequences. Just the man who had noticed her while she was trying to remain invisible. and the woman who had finally learned that wanting something openly was not weakness. Mira held out her hand exactly as she had that first night. Kale's eyes dropped to it. Her heart still beat faster. Perhaps courage did not mean the absence of that feeling. Perhaps it meant having no joke prepared in case the answer hurt. Alpha King, she said solemnly, though a smile threatened at the edges of her mouth. Would you still like to marry me? Kale looked at her for a long moment. Then he placed his hand in hers. His fingers closed around hers in the same familiar way. No take-backs. Mira smiled. I'm not planning any. And beneath the same moonlight where an accidental proposal had begun everything, Mira chose him again. This time there was nothing accidental about it.